for Microsoft. Welcome to the session. I know this is a session right before lunch, so I'll try to keep it brief and so this session is kind of to. So let me probably ask start with the question. So how many of you here have not heard of HTML5? Okay, we have one person. So pretty much the entire audience has heard about HTML5, right? And you can probably be forgiven for thinking that is this just all marketing speak? I mean, is that something that we can go ahead and use today? I mean, what is this whole deal with HTML5? I mean, the fact of the matter is not every user who comes to our web applications are on browsers which have support for many of these specifications that we are talking about. So there is another talk that I'm doing later today where the focus is completely on how you can build web applications to enable how we can leverage HTML5 capabilities and still provide a good experience for folks who don't who come on browsers which don't support those specifications. So here this talk is focused on what pieces of the HTML5 specification are or we'll just pick some that we can use today in our web applications. And the focus is kind of on the ASP.NET framework, on the Visual Studio tooling support, and how it integrates with some of these HTML5 and the CSS3 capabilities, and how we can use them in our web apps today. So briefly, that's the agenda. There are not too many slides. I'll probably just walk through some code samples and so on. So probably spend a little bit of time talking about how Visual Studio provides. What kind of an experience does Visual Studio provide for Visual Studio 2011 provide for things like CSS3, things like the HTML5 semantic tags, and so on and so forth. And we'll see some capabilities that ASP.NET brings to web development in general. So we'll take a look at some of these examples there. We'll see, for example, in ASP.NET MVC4, which is the latest revision, the latest version of the MVC framework. So we'll see how that brings in support for HTML5, semantic tags and some of these capabilities. And then we'll take a look at a sample which kind of puts together some of these ideas and sees how how we can use, for example, DOM storage to enable or to enrich the user experience in a regular ASP.NET web application. So that kind of is the premise. So with that, I'll probably straight away jump into the first part of the demo. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and launch Visual Studio. So I'll go ahead and create a new project here. So this is Visual Studio 2011, and I'm going to select an ASP.NET MVC4 application here. So let me just zoom it so we can take a look at this screen here. So you can see that with 2011, you're able to create projects which conform to the latest revision of MVC, the Model View Controller framework for ASP.NET. So I'll just create a new web application. So there are a few templates here. I'm going to go ahead and select an internet application. Hit OK. So it goes ahead and creates a bunch of stuff for us. To start off, probably we'll do something really simple. Let me just add a HTML page to this. So I'll just call foo.html. Now the first thing that you can probably notice is that the default template for HTML markup that's generated is already HTML5 compliant. So for example, if you look at the doc type right at the top, so that's the new HTML5 doc type, right? So who here can recite from memory what is the doc type for XHTML transitional 4.1? I've got a goodie for you if you can recall that. I mean, nobody can, right? So in fact, in Visual Studio, if you want to do that, you can do that. So there's a snippet for that. I think it's called HTML4T, and then you hit tab, so you get that whole blur, right? Whatever that means. So that's the doc type that you use for HTML4 and transition and so on. And HTML5 looks like that. No goodie for recalling that, because that's super simple, right? So doc type HTML, and you can notice that right here at the top. The IDE itself does validation of your markups. As you are modifying the markup, the IDE can validate your markup against the DTD for which you have defined your markup, and which DTD is being used is in that drop down there, and there are a few options there. So right now it says it's HTML5, and it did that. It selected that by parsing your HTML. So for instance, if I take off this XML NS here, okay. So what sometimes happens is, no wonder this is called beta, it automatically updates to HTML5, right? So basically, this is not XHTML, this is HTML. And you're able to select different validation models here. So depending on what doc type you select there, it validates your markup. So you will get those squiggly lines. So sometimes we get a squiggly line saying that it doesn't know what is a video tag, right? So chances are you've got the wrong doc type selected at the top. So what else can you do? So HTML5 brings to the table what is known as semantic tags, right? So far we used to, web development from a markup point of view was just a matter of defining a bunch of divs, right? So you say div, you create a graph of divs, and then you style them, and that's life. Now with HTML5, that's good because you are able to present the way you want it to be presented. But if you're talking about tools, right? For example, a search engine, right? The Google crawler, the Bing crawler, they come and try to parse your page. There's only so much information you can infer programmatically, right, in an automated fashion from a bunch of divs, right? For the crawler, it's just divs. There is no meaning that it can draw from the divs. So with HTML5, we are able to create and define or lend structure to a markup. We are able to say that this is a header, this is an article, this is an aside, this is a footer, right? This is a figure, this is a caption, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, they have no implication on the presentation. They are all block elements, right? They're all rendered as block elements. There is no effect on the presentation. That still needs to be defined through the CSS. But now tools are able to make better sense of your page. For instance, with assistive technology, right? With screen readers. So in fact, you should try this. So I did this experiment. So I tried to enable the Microsoft narrator, and then I try to visit a page. I just close my eyes and try to use the site, right? So I was using the mouse. And I'm telling you, with markup, with HTML5 markup, with support for area, which is the specification that allows you to decorate your markup with additional semantic meaning that screen readers and assistive software can use. Even with all that, it was a horrible experience to trying to use the site with my eyes closed, even with assistive technology, right? So I had a new appreciation for that whole field, right? So people who it's really difficult, right? So if you can't see, then the web sucks for you. So we should do our part to help make our sites more accessible to folks who have can't hear or can't see, and so on and so forth. Semantic tags help there too. So now assistive screen readers are able to make better sense of your page. So let's say you have a bunch of tags, navigation links at the top, and then your article content comes here. So imagine that all of those are divs, and there's another div. The screen reader is not able to figure out where the focus needs to go. It will probably start reading link 1, and this is the text. Link 2, this is the text, and the user has to basically wait till it reads all the links and goes to your actual content. Now with here, I can put all my links inside a nav tag, and then all my content goes inside my article tag. And then the screen reader can do intelligent things. It can give an option. Do you want to see the navigation section, or do you want to see the article section? And the user can select navigation article. It's a much richer user experience. So all that to lead to the fact that Visual Studio has support for all these new semantic tags. So for example, I can say header, and then you can see that the header tag shows up. You can say article, the article tag shows up. So directly supported in Visual Studio in the IntelliSense. And this is there even in Visual Studio 2010. So there is an extension that you can download from Visual Studio Extension Gallery, and you install for Visual Studio 2010, and then you get all this goodness for 2010 as well. Some of the other interesting things that Visual Studio brings to the table is with CSS. So for instance, let me go and open a CSS file here. So some of the my favorite enhancements in Visual Studio 2011 is, for example, when you're specifying the there's a nice color picker that has been integrated here. Folks might have already seen this. So for instance, if you are assigning a value to an element where you're assigning a color, then you get a nice color picker here. And you see that a bunch of colors are displayed there. Now these colors are not random colors. So the Visual Studio has actually parsed that CSS and figured out what is the palette of colors they're using in this CSS, and it shows those colors there by default, and then you get to choose one of those. If you want to customize it, you hit a down arrow again, and then you get a full-fledged color picker. There is support for CSS3 color models as well, the alternate color models like RGB or RGBA, where you're able to specify an alpha value for your color. So for instance, you give red, green, and blue, and then you want to say that you want to add an element of transparency to that color, right? So that's called the RGBA color model. So that code would look like this. So you would say RGBA, and then you give the red value, the green value. Okay, whatever. I'm just making up some color here. And then you can also specify an alpha value. For example, I want this color to be rendered in 0.3. So it's a value that ranges from 0 to 1. 0 is completely transparent. 1 is completely opaque. So the color picker supports that as well. So for instance, if I go here and change the opacity value here, you can see that the color specification also changes, which is pretty nifty. So that's a couple of things that you can do there. Another pain point, that probably is there for CSS designers is the fact that when you're using some of these CSS3 attributes, you have to use vendor prefixes. How many of you here use vendor prefixes when you're designing your pages in CSS? How many of you know what is vendor prefix? Now it puts out the specifications as modules. So there are CSS3 modules for color, for border radius, for transitions, for transforms, 2D transforms, for 3D transforms. And now browser vendors have the flexibility to implement different modules piecemeal. So they don't have to implement the entire CSS3 suite of specifications. Now it's modularized, and there's more flexibility. You can push out features more rapidly. So the flip side of that is that, again, browser compatibility, right? So you have to support folks who might come in a browser which does not support a particular rule that you want to use in your app. I want to use border radius, but what if somebody comes in a very old version of IE or Firefox or Chrome or Opera or Safari that does not have support for border radius? What happens to them? Or maybe they're coming in the version of the browser which has support for a vendor prefixed version of that rule, right? So what would vendors do? For instance, if you want to apply a border radius, probably not to the HTML tag, let's say for the nav here, it doesn't matter. So I'm specifying border radius is 5px, right? Now this is the W3C way of doing it. So border dash radius, and you provide a radius value in pixels. So the browser would go ahead and put a border radius in all the 4 corners. You can customize that. You want only the top, left, bottom, right. You can do all kinds of fancy things. But the thing is, the border dash radius, that syntax is the W3C syntax. Now before this, now it's pretty much become a standard. All browsers implement this. But older versions of Chrome and Firefox would implement a vendor prefix version because the spec was not frozen yet. It was still in a draft state. It was in an early state. So while that spec was being finalized, what would browser vendors do? They would provide support for this like that. So you would have to specify, WebKit border radius. It would be the same syntax, right? And Moz border radius. And Opera has -o-, right? WebKit is for Chrome, Moz is for this Firefox, for Microsoft is -ms-. So essentially what this means is, if you want your page to work as well as it can across as many browsers as it can, then that pretty much means that you're going to have to specify this for all the prefixes, right? Including the prefixless version. So I'll have to say border dash radius 5px. And it is not by accident that I put the W3C standard version at the last. That's also a best practice. So if you're defining CSS3 rules and using vendor prefixes, make sure that you use the W3C version of that particular rule last in your list. Because how is CSS handled by browsers? So here's a question. So let's say you have the same rule specified multiple times. How does, which version does the browser pick? The last one, right? So if I specify background color and then I specify background color again, or if I have 2 different rules which, depending on how it's been applied to the element, basically there is this conflict resolution process, right? So if you have the same rule specified redundantly, then the browser simply picks the last one, which, the latest specification applies. So in this case, imagine the user is on a browser which supports the vendor prefix version and the W3C version. And it turns out that the vendor prefix version works slightly differently from the W3C version, right? So in this case, which version do you want to work? you want the W3C standard behavior to work, because that's what that's going to be uniform across browsers. So in that case, it makes sense to make sure that the order is like this. So if you went and did something like this, then basically Chrome, which has support for -WebKit border radius and border radius, would apply the behavior as it applies to WebKit border radius, right? Because that occurs last. So feel free to use vendor prefixes, but make sure you also specify the W3C one and you put it last. And as you can imagine, this is painful, right? You have to type all this, the same rule how many ever times, right? Whichever browsers you want to support. So here I've just put the three. So IE supports border radius, WebKit and Chrome and Firefox. Maybe I want to support Opera, then I have to say -o-. Safari also supports WebKit. Now in Visual Studio, there are snippets. The snippets bit works for this as well. So if I just type border-radius and hit tab twice, it will basically expand the specification with all the vendor prefixes, and then I'm able to I don't know, say 10px or something, right? And I hit enter, then basically that works for that whole thing. Maybe let's try animation. Now they have animation. So there you go. For opacity, it's there, right? So I type opacity and hit tab, and you get, interestingly, we get the filter thing as well. How many of you know what is that syntax? The filter blah. If you don't know, don't worry about it. So this was for supporting IE6 and IE5, where it had support for opacity, amazingly. And it worked with this syntax. Basically, it used DirectX filters. It really doesn't matter. But it's interesting to see that the snippet includes code for that as well. So this is a nice little trick to save some typing. And then, of course, there is IntelliSense support for all the CSS3 stuff. For example, if I want to add an animation, right? So I can say, there you go. So for example, here, you can see or maybe you can't see that, it's too small. So again, in IntelliSense, you find that there is support for keyframe. So keyframe is how you define an animation, and then you can take that animation and apply it to another block element or any other kind of element. And you can see that there are different prefixes, different vendor prefix versions supported as well. And then you can go ahead and define the animation inside this, right? So you get a full-fledged, as you might expect, a good experience with CSS3 in Visual Studio as well. The next thing that I wanted to kind of talk about is, this is not strictly HTML5, but it's a nifty enough feature that I thought I'll pop that into the session. So with MVC4, there is support for CSS and JavaScript file minification. So how many of you here do not minify? Okay, how many of you here do not know what I'm talking about? What is minification? Anybody who does not know what is minification? So I have a few folks. So basically, it's a best practice. It's a web development best practice where it's useful to for example, if you go to Gmail, right, and do view source, it looks like machine code, right? Nobody can figure out what's going on. The reason is that the browsers do not have to have nicely formatted code, right, with nice comments and spaces and everything. Browsers, as long as it's valid CSS, valid script, they can take and execute it. So it turns out that if we can apply some tools on your JavaScript and your CSS to minify them, which means that get rid of all redundant spaces which are not necessary, get rid of comments, and so on. Anything that won't affect the behavior of the CSS or the JavaScript, then we can drastically reduce the file sizes, right? So if you do minification and then you compress your script and CSS, you can really achieve some amazing, reduction in the network bandwidth. Like the lesser the time it takes for all of your resources download over the wire to the browser, the better the user experience. So there are plenty of tools out there that do this for you. Many frameworks support this out of the box. Like as part of your development workflow, you can run these tools and they will minify your script, minify your CSS, and then you're all set. It turns out Visual Studio has support for this directly. So for instance, what you can do is you can go to, for example, here, right at the top. So this is your standard link href, right? So I have link href, and then I specify /content/css, /scripts /js, and so on and so forth. So these are relative to this. So here I have content, and I have all the CSS files inside that. And here I have scripts folder, and I have a bunch of JS files inside that. Now what happens when I actually run this site, right? So let me go ahead and hit Control F5 here. So this is the default template for Visual Studio. Now let me just open F12 and show you what some of that script looks like. So for instance, if you see here, I had a whole bunch of JS files here, right? So you can see that there are a lot of JS files here. Knockout.js, Modernizer, jQuery, a bunch of jQuery UI files, and so on. But if you look at the script tab in the debugger here, where did that go? There you go. We have just one single reference here, right? So what happened? Where did all those JS files go? So that little code that you saw so right here. So what this basically does is, when you give that path there, script/js, ASP.NET will go figure out what are all the script files that are there in that location. It will combine all of them into a single JS file, and it will minify all of them. So all of this work happens automatically for you, and it does all the smart things. Like for example, it will not do this for every single request. The first time a request hits, it will minify and compress and minify and join all the files and minify them and create a JS file, and then it will cache it. And then subsequent requests will simply take that cache and render that. So it will do all the things that you might expect, but you get that for free, right? You don't have to do anything special. So if I open this JS, so the comments are retained there for legal reasons. Like if you use some library, then you have to keep the license there. But you can see that the code itself looks like junk. But browsers can make sense of this. And the same thing applies to your CSS. So if you go to my style sheet here, maybe what I can do is I can go to my network tab, and I'll just refresh this page. There you go. That's my CSS. So unification also has a benefit, right? So instead of creating a bunch of JS files and the browser has to issue 10 requests to get 10 JS files, it's much more efficient to have a single file, put all of your JS in that, and have the browser get that file in a single network call. So that's why the combining piece happens. Good question. So how do you debug this on the client in the browser, right? So during a debugging, you probably don't want to do that. So this is probably something that you want to do in your production, but your debugging phase, you don't want. If you want to debug it on the client, but on the obviously, right, on the server side code, you don't have an issue. But during debugging, obviously this won't help, because all your code is just all over the place. But if you see here, for the CSS, there are only 2 requests, because we had 2 CS includes, and for the script, you can see there is only 1 request. There's only 1 request, because all the JS files got combined. We had 2 CS includes, so CSS includes, so we see that. I can double click this and see the response body, and you can see that the CSS has been minified also. This is not how we define it in the file, right? So ASP.NET is automatically on this. So again, probably not much to do with HTML5, but pretty nifty thing that ASP.NET brings to the table. Another thing that MVC brings is, it uses semantic tags in the default template. So this is the layout.cshtml, and you can see that here we have a header, we have sections, and all the semantic tag goodness is already there, and so on. So which is a nice touch. And the default template is actually responsive. Now what I mean by responsive is how do you make your app scale nicely for different form factors, right? If I visit the page on my desktop, now that's a pretty decent layout, but this layout would not work very well on a phone, right, or on a tablet. You want the layout to be optimized for that. So CSS3 has this feature called CSS3 media queries. So media queries is a CSS3 feature which allows you to customize your styles depending on the, for example, the display resolution. In fact, let me show you what that code looks like. So I'll just go to content/site.css. So all these styles that you see here are the default styles that get applied by default. Now, this is a big CSS file. There we go. So right here, so you see that little rule there that says at media on screen, and then there is this filter criteria, right? So basically what happens is, what this line means is that the browser is going to interpret it this way. So whenever the available client area is 850 pixels or less, right? Apply all these rules that fall within that curly brace. So in case the client area is greater than 850 pixels, it's just going to ignore all this stuff. It's not going to apply. So this is basically the mechanism that you can use to support different kinds of screen resolutions. So I can have a rule here for my phone, right, where I'll probably size my elements appropriately that make sense for the phone form factor. For the desktop form factor, I might do a different thing, and so on. So that's what is happening here. So one easy way of checking that out is to see what happens when I simply resize my browser. Now you can see that this is. So one thing that you can probably notice is there is no horizontal scroll bar, right? No horizontal scroll bar. So what has actually happened? The browser has actually dynamically re-laid out my content depending on the screen available screen space. So here, for example, you can see that the way it renders this is slightly different, right? The images come in a different way. As I have more space, it does a different rendering. Now I have multiple columns here, right? And here it's a 3-column layout, and as there is more space, it adds another column. It's pretty fancy. So the ASPnet MVC, this is the default template. A lot of work has gone into the template to. A template itself is a good way of learning some of the best practices. Your CSS gets minified. You're using good web development principles. So just go file new project MVC4 and just study that code. That's a pretty good learning experience. That's an easy thing to do, right? So basically, if you have an older browser which does not support media queries, they're just going to ignore that. That line doesn't make sense. So that's one nice thing about the web, right? You can use the new features, and older browsers are not going to choke and simply refuse to render the page. They'll do what they can. They do the best with what they can, right? They're amazingly permissive in that regard. So that's another next thing that I want to kind of talk about. The last thing I want to kind of cover is how you can use one particular feature called DOM storage to enhance your web applications. So I just want to briefly spend a little bit of time talking about DOM storage. So what is the single the most popular client persistence mechanism that we use today? That is, if you want to store a piece of data it's a fancy way of saying that if you want to store a piece of data on the browser, right, on the client, and you want that to persist across sessions, across multiple user sessions. Like user can visit your site, I want to store some information there, you can close the browser, come back to the site later, and that information should persist. So how can you do that? Today, how do you do that? Cookies. So HTML5 brings a suite of technologies actually to enable this in a much more nicer way. When cookies have some drawbacks, there's only so much information you can store in cookies. I think it's about 2K, maybe 4K. It's just a string. Right, so you have to so if you have some structured, maybe you have a JavaScript object and you want to store that into your cookies, you have to take care of the serialization. You have to convert it into string, save it in the cookie, get back the string, deparse it, and bring it back into an object. So you have to do that. And secondly, cookies get sent up and down your HTTP requests, right? For every request, your cookies are also sent to the server, and the server will send those cookies back to the client. A round trip happens. Even for things like images, which is completely wasteful, right? So if you're requesting an image or a CSS, you're not doing anything with that cookie on the server, right? But it will still get sent. Because the browser does not know if you're doing anything with that on the server, right? Maybe you are, who knows? Sometimes you dynamically generate images, right? And you want cookies there. Anyway, so there are some drawbacks with cookies. So HTML5 brings something called DOM storage to the table, which is a nicer API for client-side storage. DOM storage has two variants, local storage and session storage. So with session storage, what you can do is you can persist information on the client where that information is retained across pages for that single session. So I have connected to your site. I'm browsing your application. I'm going from page 1 to page 2 to page 3. And I have used the session storage API to store information on the client. That information will persist across those pages, right? You don't lose it. That's the idea. The code looks very, very simple. In fact, if you don't know DOM storage, we can learn it right now. So I'll just use a little console here that I use for. So for example, here if I want to store a piece of information in my session storage, I can do something like this: window dot session storage of foo equals bar, right? So that's what the code looks like for storing some piece of information in session storage. I mean, as simple as that, right? And accessing that value is again, for example, I can say alert window. In fact, you don't have to say window dot, because if you don't qualify something with an object name, JavaScript will use it from the current execution context, and in this case, it will be window. And I can hit Control Enter, and you can see that that value is there. Now, the nice thing is this value will be retained for this entire session, right? But if I close the browser, it's gone, right? So that's session storage. Now, there is another variant called as local storage, and the only thing that's going to change is what property you use, right? And that's it. So in this case, this information, Control 4, right? So in this case, this information is getting stored in local storage. So I can close the browser. I can come back here. Oops, just refresh that page. Maybe I will take off this first line. I'll hit Control Enter, and you can see that it still gets bar, right? So this is a completely new browser instance. I closed that browser, I opened another instance, and that value I'm still able to get back. And the API couldn't get any simpler, right? And the nice thing about this API is you can store anything you want here. So I can say local storage of person equals, I can, for example, I can just put a JSON object here. I mean a JavaScript object here. So I can say address, street 1, something, right? Yeah. So I'll copy that. I'll run it, close that, open a new window, localhost eval. So I'm not going to run that. I just want to know the structure to write it correctly. So I just want local storage of person, let's say .addr.st, right? So I'll just get rid of that. Unable to get value, blah, blah. Anybody know what happened? I think you're right. So it says it's an object. So debugging on stage. By the way, this console that you're seeing here, oops, is something that I use to quickly try out stuff. You know what we can do? We can hit debugger here and see what we get. So I can say var obj. This gets me a chance to show you what the IE10 debugger looks like if you haven't seen that. So I'll copy that code. I'll hit F12. Can go to script tab here and hit start debugging. So little error in my console. We'll ignore that for now. So I'll put my code there, and then I will probably put some code here. I'll say alert obj, and then I'll hit Control Enter, and you can see that it hits that in the debugger, right? So debugger is a statement that allows you to put a breakpoint, a hard breakpoint in your source code. And then now I'm able to hit F10 to look at that code, and now we can take a look at what this object is. So it put it as object, right? So maybe here you need to do serialization as well. Maybe probably I was wrong there. So in this case, if you want to store that entire object, you probably have to do JSON.stringify, which is again a new feature in ECMAScript 5, to take your JavaScript object, convert it to a string, and then you have to parse it back as well. So it's a key value where you can store strings. You learn something new every day. All right. So that's what local storage and DOM storage is about. So I put together a little app here. I mean, it's not a very fancy app. I'll just hit Control F5 and show you what it does first. So you can see that I've been trying that. So let's say I fill this form out. Say I say foo, the last name is bar, foo@bar.com. I'll say this is my bio. And how many times do we have scenarios where in our web application we have this big, long, complicated form, and users are filling it out. Something happens, right? The display driver crashes and your machine is rebooted, right? And then what happens to all the data that the user I just typed in my form? Oh, don't tell me I have to type it again, right? So this is a very, very poor user experience that happens in many sites, and we've been there and we've all been frustrated by that. What if we could do something here where I have this form, I haven't hit submit yet, I'm still working on this form, but something happens and it's gone, right? That whole the browser crash maybe. Now what if we could provide this experience, right? I come back to the site and all my data is still there, ready for me to submit, right? So that's that's something that you can delight your users with. So I've used this is a regular ASP.NET site, but I've used DOM storage to provide this functionality here. It's nothing fancy. So I simply have an object called form cache, which I have defined right up here. Form cache has just two methods, save form and load form. In save form, what I do is, so these are basically the IDs of on my form, first name, last name, email, and bio. So I just iterate through each element and put it in my cache store. Cache store is again just a very simple object here, which abstracts away the fact that I'm using local storage. So for example, you might want to put your code here for what if the user is on a browser which does not support DOM storage. Maybe you will use cookies for this, I don't know. So you can do that here. So here obviously I'm using DOM storage. So this has put and get, where I can give an ID and a value, and all it does is it simply puts it into the local storage or retrieves it from the local storage. So what I do in form cache is, in save form, I simply iterate through every element and put it in my cache store. In load form, I again iterate through every element here and initialize that appropriate text field with the value from my cache store, nothing fancy. The only additional piece of code here is this thing here. What I do is I do a set interval, and every 1 second I simply call the save form method, right? If you're wondering what this bind method does, how many of you know what this bind does? Anybody want to take a shot? This is an ECMAScript 5 feature. Again, IE has I think one of the best in class implementations of ECMAScript 5. ECMAScript 5 is the latest specification of JavaScript. The standard name for JavaScript is ECMAScript. So bind is one of my favorite features in ES5. So what it does is, see, I could have done something like this, right? So I could have just given form cache.saveform, and that would have worked also, or kind of worked. What would have happened in this case is set interval would have simply called the saveform function, right? Now the question is, in my saveform function, what am I doing? I'm saying this.ids, right? The question is, what will be this inside saveform? If you call it like a global function, this will be, it will be in fact the window object, right? And that's not what we want. Because window object does not have IDs. IDs is inside the form cache object. So ECMAScript 5 has this feature where you can, all function objects have a method called bind, where you can pass an object to the bind method, and that will basically return a variant of that function where this is permanently bound to that parameter that you pass there. So in this case, this bind will return another version of saveform where this inside that function is permanently bound to the form cache object, so, which is where we have the IDs. And that's it. So every 1 second, my saveform method gets called, and all it does is it walks through my form, takes all the data, and puts it into local storage. I mean, the implementation details actually probably don't matter very much, but it gives a nice UX, right? So that was just a very brief example of how you might enhance provide a little extra to your users, where the user experience is enhanced by an order of magnitude actually. I mean, when it happens, it's useful to have. All right, so with that, we kind of come to the end of the session. So some of these features that we saw, DOM storage in fact is a feature that is supported right from IE 8 onwards. So IE 8, IE 9, IE 10 has support for that. Some of the other things that we saw, like for example, CSS3 2D transforms or transitions and so on, they are supported in IE 10. At this point in time, the only way you can look at IE 10 is on Windows 8 Consumer Preview, so you can get that from there. Download 2011, experiment with it. There's a nice session on the build conference videos where they talk about this in somewhat additional detail. That's the URL for that, OY4ZFB, blog, Twitter, and email handles. If you have questions, we can take them up. Especially something has been bothering you about HTML5. How do we use this aspect of it? We can probably talk about that. Spend some time on that, because I think we have 7 minutes. Or if you're hungry, you can go have food. Yeah. Yes.
You told that we use saving cache for the client side, so that when the user comes back, we can find how the fields fit.
Correct.
But will it have an impact? Do we have a number of fields in the form? Will it have an impact on the performance?
Right.
If it is too long, it seems that the field is empty.
Right. The question is, okay, this is interesting, but what if I have a form which has more than 4 fields, which I had conveniently? So I would say that if you have a form where this loop that runs every 1 second and iterating over your fields can be a performance issue, I think you have an UX issue even before that. You probably shouldn't have a form that's that complicated. A loop that runs over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 fields even, right? It should be practically nothing. Like from a UX point of view, it should be completely unnoticeable. If you have enough to cause a concern, then that means that you have some humongous form. Or even if you, as you said, if you have a grid with many rows, even that should, to a vast majority of the cases, should scale really nicely. But otherwise, I think, ideally that should not be a concern. But if you have a concern, then I think you have other problems. It's probably a UX issue that's there, even before you get that issue.
So one on the IDE front, what is the kind of support that is there for HTML5, CSS3, and Visual Studio 2010?
So the question is, in Visual Studio 2010, what kind of support we have for CSS3 and HTML5? So there is a plugin, an extension in Visual Studio Extension Gallery, which you can download and install for VS 2010, and that gives you many of the things that I spoke about today. The IntelliSense support, the automatic expansion, the snippet support, again, IntelliSense on CSS3, some of the ECMAScript 5 features. There is the support for the object methods and the array methods, JSON methods, and so on. So all of these you can get through that extension to VS 2010. Some of the things that you probably won't get is, for example, the color picker is something that's going to be there in 2011. But yeah, you get a big chunk of stuff in 2010 is today, right now. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's say you have an HTML5 site and you have information like the credit card and all that. So your site is going to say that to your local store even without asking you. And
Absolutely.
it's a shared computer, there might be privacy concerns. So is there something being done either by the browser vendors or W3C or Microsoft?
The question is, in this particular scenario, what if my form captures credit card information? And then it saves that on the client, right? Yeah, that's probably a bad idea. So there are a couple of things that I want to say in that. That's a good question, because now I can talk about security. Like with DOM storage, right? What is the security implications of it? So if I go and say local storage of key equals value, does it mean that, let's say I'm on site example.com, I fill out some form and store some data there. Can somebody else come and read the data, right? By somebody else, what I mean is I'm going to some other site, and that site says local storage of this particular key. Will they get the value? They will not. Because just like cookies, local storage APIs are scoped by the domain, right? So from domain A, you cannot access the values from domain B. That's not going to be possible. But the rest of the stuff is up to your app, right? So if you have credit card information, you absolutely should not be taking that and storing that in your on the client side. The browser itself doesn't bring anything to that. For example, does it encrypt your local storage stuff? We don't know. The browser, that's an implementation detail that the spec does not talk about. Browsers might do that. They might take the stuff that is there in your local storage, and we don't even know where it stores it, right? So, and we don't need to know as well. Maybe they encrypt it, maybe they don't, but we can't rely on it. Yes?
Say for example, I have a shared system where one guy logs into the example.a.com and then his credit card information is captured in that form.
Right.
Even if after some time if I log into example, same domain example.com, and I do the local storage.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And you should sue that company. They shouldn't do that, and that's just bad design. Correct. So you can use any feature in an irresponsible way, right? So local storage can be used for that as well. So it's a different issue. It's not something that W3C can solve that for you, or HTML5 can solve that for you. It's your app's concern. So you've used a technology, you've abused the technology, right? So it should not do that. Obviously, PII concerns are there. Even name and age and address, right? You need to get the user's consent before you take any personally identifiable information and you do anything with it. You save it, then you better get the user's consent. That's why you press the I agree dialog. How many of you read that? I don't think anybody reads that, but some of the things that you're signing giving is that you can do anything you want with my information, right? So most people don't do anything bad with it. Or if you're getting a lot of spam in your inbox, there are some people who have done something bad with it. So yeah, so those concerns apply. The technology doesn't solve that for you. Yes?
Like you're telling that this information will be getting stored somewhere in the system.
Correct. Correct.
And if browser
Correct. So until the user goes and clears the cache, it will be there. So you can go to the browser, say clear cache. At that point, it will go away. Clearing the cache. You can't do it in one shot. You will have to pretty much. So you can say local storage, or I can say delete local storage of that key. So that's one drawback with local storage. You need to know what are the keys that you have, as opposed to, let's say, IndexedDB. So IndexedDB is also a client-side storage technology, where it kind of is similar to a relational database. It's not quite the same, but you are able to have the equivalent of a table. It's called an object store here, and you're able to enumerate rows here, and you can do some interesting things. Local storage, you can't do that. For example, I can't take my local storage and say, get me all the keys. What all have I stored? You can't do that. All you can say is, get me the value for this keys, which means that you have to know what the key is. So yeah, but you can do delete local storage of key, and that will be gone. Do you have any more questions, or?